I've been working as a freelance surveyor for about 6 years now. Most of the time it's boring work, mapping out property lines for suburban developments or checking soil stability for new highways. It's technical, lonely, and usually safe, but the job I took last October was different. It was a rush request from a real estate firm out of Charleston, asking for a topographical survey of a 300-acre plot deep in the Appalachian foothills. They offered triple my usual rate, provided I could get it done over the weekend. They said the property, an old inherited tract called Blackwood Ridge, was finally being sold off, and they needed to know if the land was stable enough for heavy machinery. If I hadn't been so desperate for the cash to fix my truck's transmission, I probably would have said no. The coordinates they sent me were miles off the nearest paved road, deep in a part of West Virginia where the cell service dies and the GPS starts making things up. I arrived at the access road around 4 p.m. on a Friday. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting that heavy, premature twilight over the valley. The road was barely a gravel scar cutting through the tree line, choked on both sides by kudzu and thick, tangled underbrush. I parked my truck at the rusted gate that marked the property line. It was secured with a brand new, heavy-duty padlock that looked completely out of place against the rotting wood of the fence. I grabbed my gear, backpack, tripod, total station, and a machete for the brush, and hopped the fence. The first thing that hit me was the smell. You know that scent of damp earth and rotting leaves? This was that, but sweeter. Sickeningly sweet, like meat that's been left out in the sun too long, masked by the smell of wet pine. The second thing was the silence. Usually these woods are loud. You've got crickets, cicadas, birds calling out, the wind in the canopy. But Blackwood Ridge was dead silent. It felt like walking into a recording booth where the walls absorb all the sound. My boots crunching on the gravel sounded like gunshots in that quiet. I hiked about a mile in, following the old, overgrown logging trail. My plan was to set up base camp near the center of the plot, get some initial readings, and then sleep in my tent until sunrise. According to the old maps the agency sent, there weren't supposed to be any structures on the land, just timber and rocks. They were wrong. As I came around a sharp bend in the trail, the trees opened up into a small, bowl-shaped clearing. Standing there, half swallowed by vines and moss, was a cabin. It wasn't a hunting blind or a shed. It was a full 2-story house, crooked and sagging, with windows that looked like empty black eye sockets. I stopped dead in my tracks. A structure this size complicates the survey. I had to document it. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the screen flickered and died. Battery drained. I cursed, grabbing the backup digital camera from my bag. I walked closer, the feeling of unease growing in my gut like a tumor. The front door was missing, ripped off its hinges. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned dangerously under my weight. I peered inside. It was a hoarder's nightmare, but old. Decades of trash piled up. Newspapers from the late 90s, rusted cans, piles of molded clothes. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something on a small, dusty table right in the center of the entire house. It was the only clean surface in the entire house. Sitting on the table was a violently bright blue object. I stepped closer, the floorboards screaming with every inch. It was a walkie-talkie. Not an old one either, a modern, heavy-duty Motorola, the kind construction crews use. The little green light on top was blinking slowly. Blink, blink, blink. Someone had been here, recently. I reached out and picked it up. It was cold, but there was no dust on it. I pressed the talk button, intending to call out, to see if maybe another surveyor or a squatter was nearby. "Hello? Anyone out there?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Silence. I waited a few seconds, feeling foolish. I was about to clip it to my belt and head back outside when the radio crackled to life in my hand. Static hissed, sharp and loud, followed by a voice. It didn't sound like it was coming from another radio. It sounded like a recording of a voice played back at the wrong speed. Low, gargled, and wet. Blue jacket, black hat, looking at the table. My blood turned to ice. I looked down at my chest. I was wearing a blue North Face windbreaker. I reached up and touched my head. I was wearing a black beanie. I spun around, staring out the open door into the darkening woods, my heart hammering against my ribs. The radio crackled again. He turns around. He's scared. I didn't wait to hear what the voice said next. My flight response kicked in hard, overriding every bit of logic I had. I dropped the radio, it clattered loudly against the floorboards, and scrambled backward, nearly tripping over my own boots. I bolted off the porch, clearing the rotting steps in a single leap and hit the dirt running. I didn't stop until I had put at least 100 yards of dense brush between me and that cabin. I crouched behind a thick oak tree, my chest heaving, clutching the machete so hard my knuckles were white. I listened. The woods were fully dark now. The sun was gone, leaving only a bruised purple bruise on the horizon that was fading fast. I strained my ears, waiting for the sound of footsteps, a laugh, the crackle of that radio, anything. But there was nothing. Just the wind hissing through the upper branches and the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. As my heart rate began to slow, the rational part of my brain started to claw its way back. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Local kids messing with the new guy. It made sense. High schoolers come out here to drink, they see a truck parked at the gate, they spot me hiking in, and they decide to scare the hell out of me. That radio was probably part of a set. The other one was likely in the hands of some teenager hiding in the bushes, laughing his ass off. "Come out!" I yelled, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the vastness of the valley. "I'm armed and I'm calling the police." No answer. The silence that followed was heavy, almost pressurized. I checked my phone again, still dead. My backup GPS unit showed no signal, just a blinking question mark where my location should be. I had a choice to make: try to navigate back to the truck in the pitch black through a mile of treacherous, overgrown logging trail, or stick to the plan, hike to the high ridge where the tree canopy was thinner and the moon might offer some light, and set up camp until dawn. Navigating the ravine in the dark was a good way to break a leg or fall into a mine shaft. I decided to head for the high ground. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut a stark white cone through the darkness. The woods took on a different character at night. The shadows stretched and warped, and the pale undersides of the leaves looked like suspended faces in the periphery of my vision. I hiked for about 20 minutes, constantly checking behind me. The terrain was getting steeper, the ground rockier. I was nearing the center of the plot, the highest point of Blackwood Ridge. That's when I stumbled. My boot caught on something rigid buried in a pile of dead ferns, and I went down hard, skinning my palms on the granite. I rolled over, cursing, and shone my light on what had tripped me. It wasn't a root. It was a tripod leg. I sat up, brushing the dirt off my jacket, and pulled the debris away. It was a yellow survey tripod, similar to mine but older, a model they stopped making in the early 2000s. It was half buried in the soil, twisted and bent as if something massive had stomped on it. I swept my light around the immediate area. About 10 feet away, tucked into a small depression in the rocks, was the remains of a tent. It was shredded, the nylon fabric gray with mildew and age. I crawled over to it. This wasn't trash from a squatter. This was professional gear. I used the tip of my machete to lift the flap of the collapsed tent. Inside, it was a sodden mass of sleeping bag filler and rot. But near the back, protected by a waterproof casing, was a Pelican hard case. I dragged the case out. It was locked, but the latch was brittle. A solid hit with the hilt of my machete shattered the lock. I opened it. Inside was a surveyor's field book and a handheld GPS unit. I opened the book. The pages were swollen with moisture, the ink bleeding, but the entries were legible. The dates were from 3 years ago. 3 years? The agency told me nobody had been up here in 30. I flipped to the last entry. The handwriting, which had been neat and technical in the earlier pages, had deteriorated into jagged, frantic scrawls. October 14th. It's not an animal. It knows my name. I heard it calling me from the tree line, but it sounded like my dad. My dad has been dead for 10 years. I'm leaving the gear. I'm running for the road. A cold sweat broke on the back of my neck. I shoved the book into my jacket. I needed to leave. Forget the survey. Forget the money. I stood up, swinging my light wildly around the clearing. That's when I heard it. It came from the direction of the ruined tent I had just searched. A soft, rhythmic, clicking sound. Click, click, click. I froze, aiming my light at the noise. Lying in the dirt where I had just been kneeling was the blue walkie-talkie from the cabin. I hadn't brought it with me. I had dropped it on the cabin floor a mile back. I stared at that blue plastic brick lying in the dirt, and for a moment my brain just refused to process it. I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that I had dropped that radio in the cabin. I hadn't touched it since. I hadn't put it in my pocket. I hadn't hooked it to my belt. Which meant only one thing. Someone or something had carried it here, and they had placed it silently, right beside my knee while I was distracted reading that dead man's journal. They had been close enough to touch me. I scrambled back, kicking dirt over the radio in my panic, swinging my machete blindly into the darkness. "Show yourself!" I screamed. My voice sounded ragged, bordering on hysterical. The woods didn't answer. No snapping twigs, no rustling leaves, just that suffocating, heavy silence. Then the dirt pile I'd just kicked moved. The blue glow of the radio's display shone through the loose soil. The static hissed again, louder this time, cutting through the quiet like a buzzsaw. "It's not an animal. It knows my name." The voice coming from the speaker wasn't the gargled, deep voice from before. It was my voice. It was a recording of me whispering the words I had just read from the journal inside my head. I hadn't spoken those words aloud. I was sure of it. I had read them silently. How could it record my thoughts? A wave of nausea hit me. I didn't wait to hear more. I left the tripod, the pelican case, and the journal. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away from that campsite. I tore through the underbrush, thorns ripping at my jeans and the windbreaker. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I was moving blindly, fueled purely by adrenaline, my headlamp bouncing erratically off the trees. I must have run for 10 minutes straight before I crashed into something hard. I hit a wooden post and collapsed, gasping for air. I shined my light up. It was a deer stand, a homemade hunting platform nailed into a massive oak tree about 15 feet up. Crude, rotting, but it was off the ground. I needed a vantage point. I needed to see if anyone was following me. I holstered the machete and scrambled up the wooden slats nailed to the trunk. A few of them cracked under my boots, but I hauled myself up, tumbling onto the small wooden platform. It was tight, barely 4 feet by 4 feet, with a low railing. I clicked off my headlamp instantly. I didn't want to be a beacon in the dark. I sat there in the pitch black, hugging my knees, trying to quiet my breathing. In, out, in, out. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The forest remained still. Maybe I had lost them. Maybe I was just paranoid, suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning or some kind of gas leak from the old mines. I tried to rationalize it, desperate for a normal explanation. Then I saw it. Through a break in the canopy, looking down into the valley toward where I had parked, a light flickered. It was distinct, 2 twin beams cutting through the mist. Headlights! My heart leaped. The police? The real estate agents? Had someone come looking for me? I squinted, watching the lights. They were stationary, shining from the location of the gate. But then the high beams flashed. Once, twice, 3 times. It was my truck. I felt a pit open in my stomach. I had the keys. They were in my pocket right now. I jammed my hand into my pocket to confirm. Cold metal. I clutched them tight. So who was turning on my truck? I watched, helpless, as the red taillights flared. The truck began to move, but it wasn't driving away from the property. It was driving in. The vehicle smashed through the old wooden gate. I heard the distant crunch of timber echoing up the valley and started tearing up the overgrown logging road. It was moving fast, recklessly fast for that terrain. The engine roared, the sound drifting up to me. They weren't stealing it. They were bringing it to me. Or they were hunting with it. I watched the twin beams of light jerking violently as the truck bounced over ruts and rocks, getting closer and closer to the trailhead. Then abruptly, the truck stopped about half a mile down the slope. The engine cut out. The lights died. Darkness reclaimed the valley.
I sat there, gripping the railing, terrified to move. Why did they stop? Then, from the base of the tree I was sitting in, directly below my feet, came a sound that made my soul wither. It was the electronic chirp of a car alarm being unlocked. Chirp, chirp. I looked down. I couldn't see anything in the blackness, but a voice drifted up from the roots of the tree. It was the exact metallic mimicry of my truck's GPS navigation voice. You have arrived at your destination.
My hands were shaking so bad I had to grip the rough wood of the deer stand just to keep from falling. You have arrived at your destination. The voice wasn't coming from a device. It was too loud, too resonant. It was coming from a throat that could reshape itself to sound like a machine. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I pressed myself flat against the rotting floorboards of the stand, praying that the darkness would hide me. The creature, because no human could do that, was right below me, 15 feet down. I heard the sound of wood scraping on bark. My heart stopped. It was climbing. The steps nailed to the tree were old and dry. They creaked with every shift of weight. Creak. A pause. Creak. It was heavy. Whatever was climbing was much heavier than a man. The entire tree seemed to shudder slightly with each upward movement. I had the machete in my hand, but the blade felt like a toy against this kind of fear. I knew if I stayed in this box, I was cornered, I was dead. I looked up. Above the stand, the oak tree split into two massive branches. One of them stretched out horizontally, intertwining with the limbs of a neighboring pine tree about 6 feet away. It was a risky jump in the dark, but it was my only exit. The scraping sound was getting closer. It was maybe 10 feet down now. I slowly, agonizingly slowly, stood up on the platform. The boards groaned under my weight. The climbing stopped instantly. Silence. Then, from just below the floorboards, a new sound emerged. It wasn't mimicry this time. It was a sniff. A long, deep inhalation, wet and snuffling, like a bear smelling garbage. It smelled me. "Surveyor," it whispered. The voice was mine again, but it was distorted, as if my own voice was being played through a speaker underwater. I didn't wait. I leaped. I launched myself off the railing, arms outstretched, aiming for the dark mass of the pine tree branches. I hit the limbs hard. Pine needles whipped my face, blinding me. I grabbed at anything solid, my fingers slipping on the rough bark. My chest slammed into a thick branch, knocking the wind out of me, but I held on. Behind me, in the deer stand, there was an explosion of noise. Wood splintered and snapped as something massive hauled itself onto the platform I had just vacated. The entire structure groaned, and then with a terrifying crack, the floor of the stand collapsed under the weight. I heard a heavy thud as the creature hit the ground below, followed by a sound that I can only describe as a chittering shriek, like a hyena laughing but deeper, vibrating in the chest. It wasn't hurt. It was annoyed. I scrambled up the pine tree, moving as high as the branches would support me. I needed to get away from the trunk. I moved limb to limb, crossing into the canopy of the next tree and then the next. I moved like a squirrel, driven by a primal terror I didn't know I possessed. I didn't stop until I was 3 trees away, perched high in the fork of a massive maple. I stayed there for hours. The moon finally crested the ridge around midnight, filtering pale, ghostly light through the leaves. From my vantage point, I could see the forest floor in patches. I saw movement. Below, near the base of the oak tree where the deer stand had been, a figure was pacing. It was humanoid, standing on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long. They hung down past its knees. It was naked, its skin a pale, sickly gray in the moonlight. It moved with a jerky, twitchy gait, like a marionette with tangled strings. It was holding something. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was my backpack, the one I had left in the truck. It must have taken it when it drove the vehicle up the road. The creature stopped pacing.
It reached into the bag and pulled out a flare gun, part of my emergency kit. It held the gun up, inspecting it, turning it over in those long gray fingers. It looked curious, intelligent. Then it raised the flare gun and pointed it directly at the tree I was hiding in. It couldn't see me. I was 50 feet up, hidden by dense leaves. It was just guessing. Or maybe it was just playing. Pop! A red streak hissed through the air, smashing into the branches a few feet below me. It didn't hit me, but the magnesium flare ignited, stuck in the bark. Brilliant, blinding red light flooded the canopy. I was exposed. The creature looked up, its eyes reflecting the red light like a cat's. It opened its mouth, unhinging its jaw impossibly wide, and let out a sound that wasn't a roar and wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a phone ringing. Ring, 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 ring. And then from deeper in the woods, another phone started ringing, and then another from the west, and another from the south. There were more of them.
The flare wasn't just a light source, it was an ignition. The dry pine needles around the magnesium slug caught fire instantly, sending a curtain of smoke and heat billowing up into my face. The red glare painted the woods in a violent, monochromatic crimson, making the shadows look like pools of blood. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't stay in the tree, and I couldn't fight what was waiting at the bottom. I looked for a window in the branches, a gap in the underbrush below that looked soft enough to break a fall. I spotted a patch of thick rhododendrons about 12 feet down and to the right. I swung off the branch, hung by my fingertips for a split second, and let go. I crashed through the bushes, the branches whipping my face and arms, and hit the dirt with a bone-jarring thud. I rolled instantly, ignoring the sharp pain in my shoulder, and scrambled to my feet. The creature near the oak tree, the one with the flare gun, let out that dial-up modem shriek again. It was a piercing, electronic screech that scraped against the inside of my skull. From the darkness all around me, the chorus answered. It was a nightmare cacophony. To my left, the sound of a crying baby. To my right, a generic ringtone repeating over and over. Behind me, the sound of a chainsaw idling. They weren't using language anymore. They were throwing every noise they had stolen at me, creating a wall of sound designed to disorient and terrify. I ran. I ran away from the fire, away from the truck, plunging deeper into the valley. The terrain leveled out, the trees thinning slightly as the ground turned from forest floor to cracked asphalt. Asphalt? I stumbled, my boots slapping against pavement. I looked down. I was on a street. Grass and weeds had split the blacktop, but the yellow double lines were still visible under the moss. I looked up, gasping for air, and stopped. The flare light from the ridge behind me cast a faint hellish glow over what lay ahead. It wasn't just a few cabins. It was a town. Dozens of structures lined the overgrown street, a general store with a caved-in roof, a row of small, identical company houses, their porches rotting away, a gas station with rusted pumps standing like tombstones. This was the settlement the agency had failed to mention. It looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of dinner 30 years ago. The sounds behind me were getting closer. The chainsaw noise was revving up, louder now, joined by the rhythmic thumping of heavy footsteps on the pavement. I needed cover. I needed walls. I sprinted down the main street, my eyes scanning the ruins. The wooden houses looked too fragile. A kick would bring them down. The gas station was glass and tin, no protection. Then, at the end of the street, built into the side of the mountain itself, I saw it. A massive concrete structure. It looked like a bunker or a processing plant for the mines. No windows, heavy steel doors. I pushed my legs to move faster, my chest burning. I could hear them on the asphalt now, the slap, slap, slap of bare, flat feet. They were fast. I reached the concrete building. The main double doors were rusted shut, welded by time and oxidation. I threw my shoulder against them, but they didn't budge. "Come on!" I screamed, panic stripping my throat. I frantically felt around the frame. Nothing. I ran around the side of the building, tearing through a wall of ivy. There, halfway up the wall, was a vent grate. It was loose, hanging by a single bolt.
I heard the baby cry sound right around the corner of the building. It was terrifyingly close. I jumped, grabbing the ledge of the vent, howled myself up, kicking against the concrete, and squeezed through the opening. I tumbled head first into the darkness, hitting a metal floor. I scrambled up and shoved a heavy rusted locker in front of the vent, barricading it. I collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, trying to stifle my breathing. Outside, the noises stopped abruptly. No more ringing, no more crying, just silence. I sat there in the pitch black, fumbling for my headlamp. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped it twice before I finally got it turned on. The beam cut through the dusty air. I was in a hallway. Concrete walls, linoleum floor peeling up in curls. It looked like a hospital or an administrative wing. I stood up, wincing at the pain in my shoulder. I was safe for the moment. They couldn't get through the concrete. I walked slowly down the hall, the light bobbing. Doors lined both sides. Director's office, geology lab, records. I pushed open the door to the records room. File cabinets were overturned, papers scattered everywhere. But on the far wall, something caught my light. It was a map, a huge wall-sized map of the Blackwood Ridge facility. I walked over to it, wiping away a layer of grime. It showed the town, the mines, and this building, the Central Operations Center. But someone had drawn on it, in thick red permanent marker, recently. There was a big circle around the room I was currently standing in, and inside the circle, written in jagged, frantic letters, were the words, "They don't want to get in, they want to keep you in." From the hallway behind me, I heard the heavy, metallic clank of the ventilation grate being bolted back into place from the outside.
The sound of the bolt sliding home echoed through the concrete hallway like a gunshot. It was followed by the screech of metal on metal. Someone or something was tightening a nut on the outside. I ran back to the vent. I threw my shoulder against the locker I had used as a barricade, shoving it aside, and peered through the grate. Darkness, but I could see a hand. A long gray hand with too many joints in the fingers. It was holding a wrench, a standard red-handled pipe wrench. It turned the bolt one last time, securing the grate to the wall with impossible strength. Then the hand withdrew. I was sealed in. "Hey!" I yelled, banging my fist against the grate. "Let me out!" From the other side, a voice answered. It wasn't a mimicry this time. It was calm, smooth, almost polite. "Protocol dictates containment," the voice said. It sounded like a PA system announcement, the tone flat and professional. "Contamination risk high, sealing Sector 4. They weren't just animals. They weren't just mimicking random noises. They were learning. They were role-playing, and I was the prop. I backed away from the vent. Panic was useless now. I had to think. I was in the Central Operations Center. If this was a mining facility, there had to be more than one way out. A fire exit, a loading dock, a connection to the mine shafts. I went back to the map in the records room. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus. The map showed a stairwell at the end of the north corridor leading down to level B2, storage and processing. From there, a tunnel connected to the east ventilation shaft. It was a long shot, but it was better than waiting here to starve. I left the room and headed deeper into the complex. The air down here was stale, tasting of copper and mildew. My footsteps echoed loudly on the linoleum. I reached the stairwell door. It was heavy steel, painted a fading industrial green. I turned the handle. Locked. I stepped back and kicked the lock mechanism. The door rattled but held. I kicked again, harder. The rust gave way with a crunch, and the door swung open. A draft of cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness below. It smelled of earth and something sharper. Ozone? I aimed my headlamp down the stairs. The concrete steps spiraled down into the black. I started to descend, counting the flights. 1, 2, 3. At the bottom landing, I found myself in a massive, cavernous room. My light barely reached the ceiling. Rows of rusted machinery, conveyor belts, crushers, sorting tables sat silent in the gloom. It was a processing plant for the ore. I moved through the maze of machines looking for the tunnel entrance. The silence down here was different. It wasn't empty. It felt watchful. I found the tunnel on the far wall. It was a dark, circular opening about 10 feet wide, reinforced with wooden beams. A sign above it read, "To East Shaft, authorized personnel only." I stepped into the tunnel. The ground here was dirt, packed hard. I had walked maybe 50 yards when my light flickered. I tapped the side of my headlamp. It flickered again, then dimmed to half brightness. Batteries were dying. I cursed under my breath. I had spares in my backpack, but the creature outside had my backpack. I kept moving, faster now. The tunnel curved to the left. As I rounded the bend, I saw a light ahead. Not daylight, not a flashlight. It was a soft, pulsating blue glow coming from a bank of monitors set into the rock wall. Computer monitors, old CRTs, bulky and beige, and they were on. I stepped into the chamber. It was a surveillance room. Dozens of screens were stacked in rows. Most showed static, but 3 of them were live. The first screen showed the front gate where my truck had smashed through. The second showed the exterior of the cabin where I found the radio. The third screen stopped my heart. It showed a high-angle view of a concrete hallway. The concrete hallway I had just been in upstairs. And standing in the middle of the hallway looking up at the camera was one of them. It was staring directly into the lens. It wasn't naked like the others. It was wearing clothes. My clothes. It had on my blue North Face jacket, my black beanie. It was holding my machete in one hand and my backup camera in the other. It tilted its head, mimicking a confused dog. Then it raised the camera to its face, as if taking a picture of the security camera. On the desk in front of the monitors, a printer suddenly whirred to life. It was an ancient dot matrix printer. The paper fed through with a loud, rhythmic zip, zip, zip. I looked at the paper as it spooled out. It wasn't printing text. It was printing an ASCII art image. It was a face, my face, screaming. And below it, typed in infinite repetition, "We are you. We are you. We are you." I heard a sound from the tunnel behind me, the tunnel I had just come from. Footsteps, but not the slap of bare feet, the heavy, crunching tread of hiking boots.
The sound of those boots hitting the dirt was worse than any shriek or roar. It was the sound of my own arrival, replayed and distorted, coming to claim me. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see it wearing my clothes, walking with my gait. I bolted from the surveillance room, diving back into the main tunnel and sprinting toward where the east shaft should be. My headlamp was dying fast now, a sickly yellow beam that barely cut 10 feet into the dark. Shadows danced and lunged at me from the periphery. The tunnel began to slope upward. The air grew colder, the smell of ozone fading, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the deep woods. I was getting closer to the surface. Behind me, the footsteps accelerated. It wasn't running, it was loping, a heavy, rhythmic bounding that closed the distance with terrifying speed. "Wait!" the voice called out. It was my voice again, but it wasn't a recording this time. It was conversational, casual. "You forgot your tripod. You can't finish the survey without the tripod." I gritted my teeth and pumped my legs harder. "Don't listen. It's just noise. It's just noise." The tunnel ended abruptly at a vertical shaft. A rusted iron ladder was bolted to the rock, stretching up into the gloom. Above, way above, I could see a faint square of gray light, the exit. I grabbed the rungs. They were slick with condensation and grime. I started to climb. My boots clanged against the metal. From the tunnel below, I heard the heavy thud of the pursuer stopping at the base of the shaft. I risked a glance down. Standing in the circle of my dying light, about 20 feet below, was the figure. It was wearing my jacket, zipped all the way up to the chin. The beanie was pulled low. But the face, there was no face. Where my features should have been, there was just smooth, pale flesh. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank canvas of skin. As I watched, the skin rippled. It pushed outward from the inside, molding itself like clay. A nose formed, then lips, then eyelids which snapped open to reveal eyes that were entirely white, devoid of irises or pupils. It smiled, a perfect, dazzlingly white smile that stretched too wide, splitting the cheeks. "Going up?" it asked. I screamed and scrambled up the ladder, slipping, banging my knees, hauling myself up with desperate, frantic energy. Below me, the metal groaned. It was climbing. I was halfway up, maybe 40 feet, when the ladder shook violently. A bolt popped out of the wall near my hand, pinging off the metal rungs as it fell. The structure was old. It couldn't take the weight of both of us. "Almost there," the thing called from below, its voice cheerful, mocking. "Don't fall." I saw the grate at the top. It was closed. Please be unlocked. Please. I reached the top, gasping, my lungs burning. I shoved against the grate. It lifted. It wasn't locked. I pushed it open and dragged myself out onto the forest floor. I rolled onto my back, kicking the grate shut. I looked around for something heavy, a rock, a log, anything. I grabbed a large, jagged stone the size of a basketball and slammed it down onto the grate just as a hand, my hand, shot through the bars. The fingers grasped at the air, inches from my boot. They were wearing my watch. I stomped on the fingers, hard. There was no scream of pain. The hand just retracted instantly, slipping back into the dark like a startled spider. I scrambled back, chest heaving. I was out. I was back in the woods. But I wasn't safe. I was on a ridge overlooking the settlement. The sun was coming up, a gray, watery dawn that offered no warmth. The mist was thick, clinging to the trees like wet wool. I looked down at the town below. The streets were full. Dozens of figures were standing in the road. They were all perfectly still, facing the rising sun. They looked like statues made of pale gray clay. Then, as one, they turned their heads. They looked up at the ridge, at me. A sound began to rise from the valley. It started as a low hum, then built into a roar. It wasn't a monster's cry. It was the sound of a radio tuning, static, voices cutting in and out, music snippets, news reports. And then, clear as day, a single broadcast cut through the noise, booming from every throat in the valley simultaneously. "Severe weather alert for the following counties. Seek shelter immediately. Seek shelter." The sky above me darkened instantly. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. They weren't just mimicking sounds. They were mimicking reality. They were manifesting the broadcast. A bolt of lightning struck a tree 50 yards away, exploding the trunk. Rain began to fall, not water, but a black, oily sludge that smelled of sulfur. I turned and ran toward the highest peak of the ridge. The map in the bunker had shown a fire tower up there. If I could get to the radio in the tower, maybe I could call for real help. Maybe I could drown them out. But as I crested the hill, I saw the tower. It was already occupied. Someone was standing on the observation deck, watching me through binoculars. He lowered the binoculars and waved. It was me. I froze. The black rain slicked my hair to my skull, stinging my skin like acid. I stared up at the fire tower, at the figure leaning casually against the railing 70 feet above. It was wearing my old flannel shirt, the one I'd thrown out years ago. It had my posture. It had my tired slouch. It raised a hand and pointed a finger directly at me, then curled it in a come here motion. I didn't move toward the tower. Instead, I backed away, my eyes darting around the clearing. The storm the creatures were manifesting was intensifying. The wind was screaming now, tearing branches from the trees. The lightning was striking closer and closer, rhythmic flashes that felt less like weather and more like artillery fire. I needed to break the loop. They were reacting to me, feeding off my fear, my memories, my very identity. The more I acted like prey, the more they became the predator. The more I tried to use technology, radios, maps, GPS, the more they used it against me. I looked down at the GPS unit still clipped to my belt, the one I'd taken from the dead surveyor's case. I ripped it off and threw it into the brush. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the surveyor's journal. I threw that away too. I wasn't a surveyor anymore. I was just meat in the woods. I turned away from the tower and plunged down the opposite side of the ridge, sliding down a steep embankment of loose shale. I needed to get to the property line, the fence, the gate. But as I slid down, the landscape began to change. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were jagged, pixelated. I blinked, wiping the oily rain from my eyes. The oak tree to my left didn't have bark. It had a blurry, stretched texture, like a low-resolution image blown up too big. The rocks under my feet felt smooth, synthetic, like polished plastic. I was hallucinating, or they were doing this. They were rewriting the environment. I stumbled onto a flat stretch of ground. Ahead of me, the woods simply stopped. Not a clearing, an edge. The world just ended in a wall of gray static, like a television tuned to a dead channel. The static hummed, a physical vibration that rattled my teeth. I walked up to it. I reached out a trembling hand. My fingers passed through the gray fog. It felt cold, numb. "End of the map," a voice whispered from behind me. I spun around. Standing 5 feet away was the me from the fire tower. But up close, the illusion was failing. The flannel shirt was fused to its skin. Its eyes were two-dimensional, painted onto the face. It looked like a video game character glitching out. "You can't leave," it said, its mouth not moving. The voice came from the air around it. "The render isn't finished." It took a step toward me. As its foot hit the ground, the texture of the grass rippled like water. "What are you?" I screamed, backing up against the wall of static. The figure stopped. It tilted its head, and for a second, the face sharpened. It almost looked human, almost sad. "We are the echo. We are what remains when the signal dies. You brought the signal back." It raised its arms. The hands transformed, the fingers elongated, turning into black cables. The cables lashed out, whipping through the air like snakes. I dodged, throwing myself to the side. A cable slammed into the wall of static behind me with a sound like a blown transformer. Sparks showered down. I saw a gap. Where the cable had hit the static, the gray wall momentarily cleared, revealing the woods, the ordinary woods. Just ordinary trees and rain. The static was a fence, a sensory fence they had built to keep me in. I scrambled to my feet. The figure was resetting for another strike. The cables retracted and reformed into hands. It was loading, buffering. I didn't wait. I charged at the figure. It seemed surprised. It braced itself, expecting a fight. But I didn't hit it. I slid past it, diving for the spot in the static wall where it had struck. "No!" it shrieked, a sound of corrupted audio files screeching. I threw myself into the gray fog. It felt like jumping into ice water. The world went white, then black, then a blinding kaleidoscope of colors. The sound was deafening, a million voices talking at once, screams, laughter, songs, static. And then silence. I hit solid ground hard. Mud. Real, cold, sticky mud. I gasped, coughing up bile. I wiped my face. The rain was water. Just water. It tasted clean. I looked up. I was lying in a ditch by the side of a gravel road. The gravel road. The access road. I looked back toward the woods. The wall of static was gone. There was just the tree line, dark and silent under the gray morning sky. But at the edge of the woods, just behind the fence line, were 5 figures. They were motionless. They were watching me. They didn't look like me anymore. They looked like shadows, tall, thin, featureless silhouettes cut out of the blackness. I scrambled up the embankment to the road. My truck was gone. They had taken it. I had to walk. I started limping down the road, away from Blackwood Ridge. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just walked. 1 mile. 2 miles. The silence of the woods was behind me, but a new sound was growing ahead. The sound of a highway. Cars. Civilization. I almost cried with relief. I rounded a bend and saw the paved county road ahead. A semi-truck roared past, its horn blasting. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But as I stepped onto the pavement, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone. It had been dead for 12 hours. I pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but it was glowing. It wasn't a call. It was a voice memo. Recording now. The
The timer on the screen was counting up. 00, 001, 0002. I hadn't pressed record. I held the phone up to my ear, my hand trembling uncontrollably. I didn't hear the ambient noise of the road. I didn't hear my own breathing. Through the speaker, crystal clear, came the sound of a door opening. Creak. Then the sound of footsteps on floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. Then a voice, my voice, whispering directly into the microphone. We're not in the woods anymore, surveyor. We're in the cloud.
I dropped the phone. It hit the pavement with a sickening crack, the screen shattering completely. I didn't pick it up. I backed away from it like it was a live grenade. The recording had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. We're in the cloud. I flagged down a passing pickup truck about 10 minutes later. The driver was an old man with a suspicious squint, but when he saw the state of me, covered in mud, bleeding, clothes torn, he let me in without a word. He drove me to the nearest town, a place called Gasaway. I didn't say a word the whole ride. I just stared at his dashboard radio, terrified it would turn on. I spent that night in a cheap motel, paying cash I had stashed in my sock. I didn't turn on the TV. I unplugged the phone in the room. I even unscrewed the light bulbs, terrified that the hum of the electricity was a frequency they could ride. I thought I had escaped. I thought distance would save me. But 3 days later, I was back in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio. I had reported the truck stolen, claiming I'd parked it at a trail and hiked back. I didn't mention the creatures. I didn't mention the mimicry. Who would believe me? I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to work up the courage to open my laptop. I needed to check my bank account, cancel my cards, email the agency to tell them I quit. I opened the laptop lid. It booted up normally. The familiar desktop background appeared, a picture of a mountain range from a trip to Colorado. Then a notification popped up in the corner of the screen. New device added to your network. Blackwood_guest. My stomach dropped. I live alone. My Wi-Fi is password protected. I clicked on the network settings. There were 5 devices connected. My laptop, my smart TV, my phone, which I had replaced, Blackwood_guest, Blackwood_admin. I moved the cursor to disconnect the unknown devices, but the mouse cursor froze. It didn't just stop moving, it changed. The little white arrow morphed. It stretched, thickened, and turned into a tiny, pixelated hand, a gray hand with long fingers. It waved at me. Then my webcam light flickered green. On the screen, a video window opened. It wasn't a Zoom call or a Skype window. It was just a raw video feed. It showed me in my living room, from the perspective of the TV. I slowly turned my head to look at the smart TV mounted on the wall behind me. It was off. The black screen reflected the room. But on my laptop screen, the video feed showed me sitting at the table, and standing directly behind my chair, looming over my shoulder, was a figure. It was blurred, translucent like a heat shimmer, but I could see the eyes, white, pupilless eyes staring at the back of my neck. I spun around in my chair. Nothing, just the empty room. I looked back at the screen. The figure in the video feed leaned in close to my digital ear. Text began to appear on the screen, typing itself out in a notepad document. Do not turn around. We are shy. I slammed the laptop shut. I grabbed it, ran to the window, and threw it out the sidewalk 3 stories down. I stood there, panting, gripping the windowsill. It's not real, I told myself. It's PTSD. It's a hacker. It's... My smart speaker, the one in the kitchen, chimed. That cheerful, helpful little ding-dong. Okay, I can help with that. Playing The Sound of Your Death on Spotify. Music started playing, but it wasn't music. It was the sound of crunching bones, wet, snapping sounds, layered over a low, guttural humming. And underneath it all, a voice, my voice, screaming. I ran to the kitchen and ripped the cord out of the wall. The speaker died. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from the fridge, from the smart display on the door. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and smashed the screen. Glass flew everywhere. The sound cut out. Silence returned to the apartment. I stood in the center of my kitchen, hammer in hand, surrounded by broken technology. I was hyperventilating. Then I heard it. A vibration, a low buzzing sound. It was coming from inside the wall, from the wiring itself. The lights in the hallway flickered. Blink, blink, blink. They were using the grid. They weren't just data anymore. They were energy. I ran to the fuse box near the front door. I tore the panel open and yanked the main breaker. The apartment plunged into darkness. Finally, quiet. I slid down the wall, sitting on the floor in the dark. I was safe. No power, no signal. Then, in the pitch black, I saw a tiny green light blinking on the smoke detector above my head. Blink, blink, and from the small plastic speaker of the smoke alarm, a whisper drifted down. Battery backup engaged. I didn't stay in the apartment. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys, my old mechanical car keys for the beater sedan I'd bought cash, and ran. I left everything else, my wallet, my phone, my clothes. I ran out into the hallway, down the stairs, and into the night. The city was alive. Streetlights hummed, neon signs buzzed. Every electronic device I passed felt like an eye opening to watch me. I could feel the static in the air, a physical pressure on my skin. I drove. I didn't know where I was going, just away, away from the grid, away from the cloud. I drove until the streetlights thinned out, until the paved roads turned to gravel, until the radio signal faded into static. I found myself in the middle of a national park in Kentucky, miles from the nearest cell tower. I found a cave, a small, damp recess in a limestone cliff. No wires, no signals, just rock and dirt. I've been here for 3 days now. I'm cold, I'm hungry, but it's quiet. Or it was. Yesterday, I found a bird, a crow. It was sitting on a branch near the cave entrance watching me. It didn't fly away when I got close. I looked at it. Its eyes were wrong. They were too reflective. And then it opened its beak. "Connection established," it squawked. It wasn't a bird. It was a drone, a biological drone. Or maybe they had just overwritten the bird's mind, the same way they overwrote the radio frequencies. I killed it with a rock. When I broke it open, there were no wires inside, just meat and blood. But the blood, it smelled like ozone, like burning plastic. I know they're coming. They aren't restricted to the valley anymore. They aren't restricted to the wires. They are expanding. They are learning how to transmit themselves through organic matter, through the wetware. I'm writing this on a notepad I found in the glove box of the car. I'm going to leave it here in the cave. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe you're reading it right now. But you need to understand something. You're reading this on a screen, aren't you? A phone? A computer? Do you hear that? That faint, high-pitched whine coming from your device? That's not the fan. That's not the battery. That's the door opening. They know you've read the story. They know you're thinking about them. That's all the connection they need. Look at the corner of your room, the shadow behind the door. Does it look a little darker than it should? Does it look like it's breathing? Don't look at your webcam. Don't check your Wi-Fi connections. And whatever you do, if your phone rings, do not answer it.